and repel the Italians, because that was their territory that was granted to them pursuant to the Berlin Conference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to drop back to Namibia, because Namibia recognized the assistance that was given to her by African Americans, and we were invited, and Reverend Daughtry, who was the chairman of the National Black United Front, well, I went with him, and Jesse Jackson was a part of that delegation, along with Nelson Mandela and everybody coming together for this wonderful celebration of the liberation of Namibia. Now, Namibia, the president of Namibia, Sam Njomo, he reached out to African Americans to give them access to working in his government as well. I was offered to run their television station, but I just wasn't prepared to make the move from here to there, because my family was here and so forth, and I had children, and they were in school, and I wasn't, I just couldn't make the leap. But I'm saying that they did reach out to give recognition and opportunity. Now I'm not aware of exactly what is put on the table to reach out from Africa to African Americans. Can you speak on it?
I know that, of course, you know that that part of Africa was given to South Africa to manage, and I know that Angola, which is a former Portuguese colony, it's very close to Portugal. In fact, I think they have the second largest amount of Portuguese living in Angola than Portugal in the whole world. So there's a closer relationship between Portugal and its colonies, which is interesting. And they seem to be having a workable relationship. But I was not, I'm not sure what I was doing when Namibia got its independence. I know I was supportive of that movement. And I was down there at the South African Embassy also.
Okay, very good. I have many documentations of demonstrations that we carried on at the South African Embassy and so forth, and it was effective. Nelson Mandela's release from prison was impacted tremendously by the demonstrations that went on here by African Americans, which was spearheaded again by Reverend Daughtry and the Black United Front. So, we started out with the Berlin Conference, and Africa being divided, and that brought along what we call colonialism. Can you speak of that? What is colonialism, and how that was not freedom or liberation, but just another means of controlling Africa and its minerals and its people?
Well, colonialism resulted after Europe became industrial. So with the industrialization of Europe, they needed the raw materials for their industries. Hence, they controlled, usually through having a leader in the country. So once they had once they were allocated their territory pursuant to the Berlin Conference, pretty much they, in general, had an African or another type leader run that particular country. So they ran the show indirectly. So that's colonialism, where they directly controlled. So these countries were not really independent. They understood that their position was they were part of the British Empire. So it was said at that time that the sun never set on the British Empire because it was so vast. But so England controlled its territories, and there was some local powers granted to the local leader, but ultimately he was answerable to the English government. That's the case with England. Now, of course, it was very similar, if not the same, with France and the other European powers. They controlled it directly. Later on, of course, we have neocolonialism, which I don't say that very well. But in that case, of course, after World War II, there was a push to grant independence to many of these countries, mostly by the Americans, who I guess wanted access to them. And as a result, these countries was let me see how I could this. They were not really granted independence, but they were led to believe that they were granted independence. So for the most part, the English and French still maintain control. And in some cases, to this very day, even though it was said that they were independent. Let me give an example. For instance, in the Caribbean, a country was granted independence after the English Parliament approved their constitution. So in negotiation with the British government, they agreed on the constitution, which had to be approved by Parliament. In addition, they had what we call a Governor General, who was the head of state. This Governor General was answerable to the English Queen. So the Governor General was the representative of the Queen in each government. And finally, their highest court was usually the Privy Council. So whatever the Privy Council is in the House of Lords in England, in English Parliament. The House of Lords is the second house of the English Parliament, and the Privy Council is in the House of Lords. So the English government was the final decision maker of any dispute in the colony or former colony. So if you were independent, your final court was in London. So any dispute that you had with any corporation or business or anything, the final arbiter was the English court in London. So many of them, I guess, believed that they were independent, but it was what we call neo-colonialism, which is still colonialism, but at least in your mind, you feel that you're independent. I think the only country, well, maybe there might have been others, but the only country that really were independent of the English were the Americans, because they actually fought for the independence and won it. But the other countries, I don't think, to the extent that the English Parliament has to approve your constitution, I can't say that that's really independence. I mean, unless, of course, I'm reading too much into it.
Now, I would almost read more independence in the Namibian liberation, because Castro and African Americans may not be as aware of Castro's input in the liberation of Angola and the breaking of the back of the South African hold on Angola and Namibia and the freeing of Namibia. But Castro sent thousands, tens of thousands of his troops to Angola to fight on behalf of the African people, because he said that Cuba was also African, that their heritage was African. And so he sent, of course, Russia had armed Cuba, as you know. And Castro sent the latest jets that they had, which they had gotten from Russia, to South Africa, not South Africa, but to Angola, along with their pilots and their soldiers and their doctors and their medical support and everything. And they were able to literally defeat Angola, the government of Angola, which caused the freeing of Namibia because it was defeated militarily. So I just wanted to throw that in, that Castro, and we look at Castro as the boogeyman, but Castro has been very supportive of Africa, and his government still is. As a matter of fact, one of our great warriors who Castro took in, Asada Secure, what's her name?
Joan Chismart, I forgot her African name.
Okay. And she's still there until today.
Mm-hmm.
And they have, American government, especially the police forces, have always tried to bribe, steal, kill, anything they could do to bring her down. And Cuba has supported her until this day. She must be near 80 now, but I know she's in at least her 70s because we came along at the same time.
I see.
I remember her struggle and so forth. And, so I'm almost 80, so I'm 81.
Mm-hmm. Praise
so
God.
I know that she's up there,
Mm-hmm.
and they have taken really great care of her. So
Mm-hmm.
I support. And then I went to Cuba and looked at what Cuba has done for its people, and they set up liberation camps for all of the African revolutionary groups in Cuba, and trained many of them.
Mm-hmm.
So when we went to Cuba, they took us out to these different camps, and
Mm-hmm.
so we could see their training and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really very impressed
Mm-hmm.
with all of the things that were going on in Cuba, how they come together and build their houses. They had a model that we could use right now
Mm-hmm.
in America. Everybody that wanted the house, worked on the house together. They came together
Mm-hmm.
and built these great projects and so forth. So, I mean, they turned banks into hospitals and all of this kind of, medical care is free,
Mm-hmm.
and schooling is free. That's why they have so many doctors all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, just looking back, sitting here talking to you, because these things pop up
Mm-hmm.
when we start talking about the Berlin Conference, because it ain't that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's what, 3 generations?
Right. It's basically at the beginning of the 19th century.
Wow, that's just yesterday.
No. Sorry, the beginning of the 18th century. No, the 20th century.
Yeah.
Sorry. So let me say that it's basically the beginning of the 20th century, because from 1900s down the way, that's the 20th century. Berlin Conference was in 1884, 1885, which is just a few years, maybe 10 years or so from the
100 years.
Yeah, but let me talk a little bit about the struggle in Southern Africa for independence from South Africa, which which Mozambique, Angola, and Southwest Africa was under the protectorship of South African government. So again, this is before what's his name of South Africa?
Ian Smith.
No, the person who was released from jail. What was his name again?
Nelson Mandela.
Before Nelson Mandela was released from prison. So, and to some extent, we benefited from the struggles between the Soviet Union. So we, in a way, we made a lot of progress during the Cold War. So the competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, which was the leader of the free world, so to speak, we benefited. In fact, that helped fuel the changes in American law to give us some protection. Because, I mean, the US and the Soviets were competing for influence in the world. And the Soviet Union were able to say, look at how they treat their own people, which was us. And it attracted many of the newly independent countries to be supportive of the Soviet Union when they said, look, their own people, they discriminate, they lynch, they do this. And that was the struggle of the 60s. And you had television, which came into vogue and was widely used, could reveal to the whole world. So it was a little bit of an embarrassment to the government of the United States, and it sort of helped us in many ways. So that's something I think that was not has not been highlighted very much. Mm-hmm. Now, so what happened in Southern Africa with the Cuban intervention in Southwest Africa, Angola, and Mozambique was part of this East-West struggle, this Cold War. And again, at that time, of course, the Cubans were the agents of the great power, the Soviet Union. And of course, we benefited, which is fine. I mean, we benefited, and we should be grateful for the Soviet Union and the Cubans, because I mean, Cuba is a very small country, and they needed the resources from the Soviet Union to finance, because as Mark said, the economic foundations, you've got to feed your troops, and you need all that, the technology of warfare. It's very expensive. So that helped us via the Cubans to dislodge and to make it very expensive for the South Africans to maintain control of Angola, Southwest Africa, and Mozambique. And ultimately, of course, I mean, I hate to, I've been involved in many negotiations. Again, I told you I was with the ministers as his advisor on trade negotiations. And I've observed that when you sit down with very powerful people, they usually call the shots. So therefore, I mean, Nelson Mandela did his best. I have no doubt that he did his best to negotiate his freedom and the liberation of his country from apartheid. But my experience is that when you sit down with someone who's very powerful, they call the shots, and the agreement is going to be one-sided. So whenever you sit down with the devil, the devil is very powerful. In the agreement that he will negotiate with you, you know, it's not going to be the best. So, but again, I think it's a start.
Would you say that there are any truly independent African countries that are not under neo-colonialist control today in Africa?
Honestly, I really haven't thought about it, and I could think about it, and I wouldn't want to give such an important question that I would feel very comfortable guessing the answer. But if I really searched and looked at it, I could come up with an opinion.
Okay. Now, I want you to, just kind of thumb through the files of your head of the things that you can relate in these files to the Berlin Conference's impact and how that has affected Africa, African Americans, and are we still, for the most part, under that European colonial domination? That's kind of like the same question, but I just wanted you to look through your files and kind of give us a summary of our program for today.
Well, we began with the Muslim conquest from that went from the Mediterranean all the way to India.
Mm-hmm.
And then that fell, and we saw the rise of Portugal and Spain. We saw the Ottoman Empire rise to replace the Muslim Empire from the Mediterranean to China once again, and of course the Spaniards and the Portuguese had to find another route to Asia, to India, and to go to the new world. So you have the relationship between the Spaniards and the Muslim led to the rise of the Spanish and the Portuguese civilization, and they became the center of the world until their decline came. And of course, to cut a long story short, we have England becoming the first country in Europe to become industrialized, which led to a lot of new technologies, and that has been the momentum for Europe since that time. The challenge of course, it led to the Berlin Conference. In fact, so the industrialization of Europe led to the need for a Berlin Conference to prevent warfare. The whole idea of the Berlin Conference was to maintain the balance of power. Created problems from Africa because Africa was not ready. It was just reeling from the end of the slave trade created an economic problem in Africa. So they were not very well organized, didn't have the resources to launch a defense. And even if they did, it's unclear that they could have withstand the superior technology of Europe at that time. So the challenge for the Africa and the challenge for African Americans is technology. Technology, which is a branch of economics, is really the prize. That's really what they should focus on. They must come up with a plan to become Europe's equal. At least one country must come up with a plan to become equal to Europe in the year 2040 or the year 2050. But I mean, I think there's a need for Europe, for African countries to adopt a plan. I mean, planning is no longer fashionable. Right after World War II, and with the independence of many of the countries in Africa and elsewhere, planning was fashionable. So you set certain goals for your country by a certain time. And planning is difficult because there's a market. There's a world market that you can't control. Like right now we're in a pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. We can't control that. It is affecting our economy. So even if we had a plan, COVID-19 would derail that plan. But still, I believe you must have a plan. And sometimes you will succeed. But countries in Africa need to have a plan to become Europe's equal by some period of time.
To become what?
The equal to Europe.
Yes.
In terms of technology, in terms of having an integrated economy. So Africa, the countries in Africa are trying to form some economic union that's similar to the European Union. And I hope that's successful. But still, in addition to having this economic union, and governance is crucial. Governance is crucial. The way the European Union is governed in a way that empowers everyone. So, and spreads the wealth around. So you can have a country like Northern Ireland becoming equal to Germany in terms of the quality of life of its people. And once Ireland was one of the poorest countries in Europe. So that shows that the Europeans' ability to spread the wealth around. So we're all on the same level. So when a country knows that joins the European Union, they know they'll benefit from a great deal of funding to get their economies up to the same level. Because unless your economy is on the same level as your trading partner, you're being exploited. So the challenge for Africa is to not just have an economic union that has a governance model. To me, the best governance model is the European Union, or even the American system. The American system of government is what the European Union has adopted, in the sense that we in America, we have the Congress, which is based on population. I mean, not the Congress, but the House of Representatives, which is based on your population. And we have the Senate, which every state has. So it lets the states know that they're not being discriminated against because their population is not great. If both houses were, the seats in both houses were based on population, countries like New York and California would run the show. And the small states like Arkansas or Vermont would be at a terrible disadvantage. And that is the model that's adopted in Europe within the European Union. And such a model is enduring because the challenge for Africa is governance. And they must have a system of governance that is enduring. And they must also have a plan to be on the same level as Europe in some period of time.
Brother Victor Jordan, I appreciate the session. I'm looking forward to the next session. What's the topic going to be on the next session?
Well, whatever you choose, brother.
Okay, let me ask you in closing. Do you see the possibility of Africa being equal technologically with Europe by 2050? That's only, what, 30 years from now?
Yes. Again, Africa has the resources. Africa has the resources to plan to achieve that goal. And it's really the political will to do it. So it's not a question of scarcity of resources. Certain countries in Africa has a great deal of resources. The challenge is to direct that resources in a way that would give that results. So they're not poor. They really are not starving. I mean, I've been to Africa. I mean, in fact, I went to Botswana, and in Botswana, there are no homeless people. So the challenge is, it's just a political will. That's all it takes. So yeah.
You did work with the Obama administration, didn't you?
No, I didn't. I was very fortunate. I worked with a minister of trade and industry in the Caribbean. And in that position, I attended many meetings of what we call the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. And the EU, they have a body that works together, and they engage in different trade negotiations. So I was in that position. I met many of the trade ministers and leaders from Africa, from the Caribbean, and the Pacific. So in that sense, I was able to get a sense of the dynamics of the situation in Africa. So I'm when I say it's possible, I say it because I'm a little informed in that respect. So and again, it was the best position I've ever had, is to be the trade advisor of a Minister of Trade and Industry.
Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
I mean, I was raised admiring W. Du Bois. I mean, he was my hero. I mean, I read as much as I could of all that he wrote.
That's W. Du Bois.
Yes.
Yes.
And I'm invited every year during Black History Month to speak at a school, usually a middle school. And I would always speak about Du Bois. But one year I just says, I'm tired of doing people that I like. I said, and I was raised not appreciating Booker T. Washington. I was raised not appreciating his work and his contribution. So I said, let me do him for just to do the other side. I mean, let me be the devil's advocate. And I was surprised. I did my research on Booker T. Washington, and I discovered it was more than the debate I read from the perspective of W. Du Bois. So I read his analysis of Booker T, but I didn't go and read Booker T's analysis and other people's analysis of Booker T. Washington. And I discovered that Booker T. Washington was a champion of the people. He was in a situation, he was in the belly of the beast. He was, and he realized that I've got to survive and serve my people. And I'm not up north. Where are you at? Hell easier. And what he did was miraculous. Given where he lived, you and I would have been lynched.
That's right.
I mean, without a doubt. And he was able to in some cases, protect people from being lynched. And he was able to grow and prosper in the belly of the beast. And I discovered, and now when I'm invited to a middle school during Black History, man, I just have to pick out a page in some book about Booker T. Washington, just read it to my class. And they're so excited. And they ask so many questions. So you never know what you will discover when you play devil's advocate. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you remember running across a quote that was made by one of the whites who studied Booker T, but he said that Booker T was not teaching blacks to be subservient to whites, but he was teaching them to be free of whites, and he was teaching them to build every aspect of their economy that they needed to be free of white folk.
Yeah.
And that he was the greatest threat to America in the country at the time. Do you remember reading anything along those lines?
Well, yes, certainly. I remember one of the quotes I would read to my students. I would read them a quote of Booker T. Washington having had dinner with the president at the time. I think it was Theodore Roosevelt, and the Southern press was angry because Booker T. was pictured having dinner with the president and his family, and they were upset because so I would read that, and then I would of course get the feedback from my class, and they would wonder why, and of course it would give them a chance to see that there's something else, there's racism, which is something they had to appreciate, and they must appreciate at some point. But the fact of but Booker T was friends with Andrew Carnegie, who at the time was the richest man in the world, and in a way, Carnegie was sympathetic to Booker T because Booker T didn't really want integration. He just wanted to maintain the separate system. I mean, you think you're superior to me. I don't have a problem with that, but just help me to develop my people into just self-sufficiency so they can go about their business and live life. So that was the miracle or the extraordinary quality of Booker T. He didn't want to integrate. I mean, if you didn't want to, but we just want to grow and prosper. And he was doing that in all aspects, helping black business, doing all of these things that would